Hello, and welcome to Megan's Mystical Mashup, a spiritual conversation between me and a guest about life, the universe, and anything in between. I'm Megan Rounds, spiritual connector, intuitive empath, energist, healer, channel. Welcome to today's show. It's going to be such an awesome one. So glad to see you here. Today's guest is a self-described, foul-mouthed, old punk rock chick who gardens and likes murder mysteries. But there's way more to her story than that. From a young age, she saw spirits as well as colorful lights around people, and despite trying her best not to do so, these experiences continued. A former Catholic Carmelite tertiary, she received her first Reiki attunements and shamanic initiations in her 20s, but was more powerfully drawn to finishing her studies and pursuing her career in psychology. She's been a practicing clinical psychologist and psychotherapist for over 20 years and spent much of her time working primarily in prisons, halfway houses, drug treatment facilities, and more recently with the sick and dying. Finally, at a less frenetic place in her career and life, she returned to her roots and is a Reiki master teacher and provider of several forms of hypnotherapy. She is also a trained shamanic practitioner in core shamanism and considers herself an intuitive with a drum who seeks answers and healing from the other world. She now sees the experiences of her youth not as a sign to follow the Carmelite path as she had once considered, but rather as direct shamanic invitation to walk with the spirits and to continue this work alongside her work as a psychologist. She has been a professional intuitive since 2010 after years of giving private tarot, rune, and intuitive readings to friends, and she offers one-on-one intuitive consultations as well as shamanic healing practices. She is also creator and operator of the Facebook group Witch and Bitch, to which I belong. Born and raised amid the cornfields of East Central Illinois, she now makes her home in Denver, Colorado with her partner Tom, 18-year-old daughter Tara, and two rescue mutts, Queenie and Colby, who you may have the pleasure of meeting today. I don't know. We will see. Please give a warm galactic welcome to quintessential badass and intrepid spiritual explorer, Dr. Justine Uselding. Hello.
Well, hello there.
Oh my gosh.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. What a lovely welcome.
It's my pleasure. I'm so excited to have you here. And it was really fun to read your introduction and hear your reaction to it. It was so fun. Because for those of you watching, I can hear the guest even though you can't. I had her muted. At least I think she was muted. If not, then you heard her reaction too.
It's hard to mute me.
Many may have tried, but none have succeeded, right?
True,
Nor shall they.
True. That's right.
Oh my. Well, I'm so happy to have you here. I've been looking forward, as I said, to this conversation for quite some time.
Me too.
So I think we should just get right to it.
Groovy. Let's do it. Let's do it.
All right. Well, what I had mentioned to you before is the way I like to start this is just with a pretty general open-ended question to tell us about your spiritual journey. And you can really start wherever you want to. It doesn't have to be linear. It can go in whatever direction you want, but I may ask follow-up questions and I may interject my own, experiences and things like that into there too. Cool. On occasion.
Please,
it makes sense.
Please interrupt me or corral me a little bit.
I'll see what I can do. Okay.
Something like that. Well, thank you so much for having me here. I am very honored. And before this, I was actually writing notes about my own life, how do we organize all this into something that's going to make sense? And thank you, Megan, for liberating me by telling me that it's okay. I don't have to go in a linear fashion. I can spiral, I can float. So that's what I'm going to do. That's an amazing introduction. Thank you very much. I have worked into some tough places in my life, and I have, that's kind of my bias is I want pretty much any spiritual approach, any sort of psychic stuff, metaphysical stuff that I'm involved with to apply to pretty much everybody, to be able to be utilized by pretty much everybody who's capable. So I'm from a cornfield in the middle of Illinois, and then I went to Iowa, and I went to undergrad in another cornfield, and then I went to Nebraska and yet another cornfield for my graduate work.
Is corn like a thing for you?
It is a thing for me. It's totally a thing for me. I love corn.
I do too.
And with shamanism, there's this great saying that you just hear a lot if you hang around enough people that are into it. And I can't remember off the top of my head where this comes from, but the saying is basically, does it make the corn grow? You know, it's sort of like, well, is this useful? Is this something that's going to be cool for everybody or what? So that it's kind of an interesting dovetailing where I'm at right now, at least for me, because I work by day as a clinical psychologist. I work in long-term care primarily. And I sometimes say by night or, you know, evenings, weekends, stuff like that, like I'm Batman or something.
Ding bat. I'm sorry I had to say it. Oh my gosh. We can work on that. Okay.
Yes. So I'm not Batman. Just that's where we ended just now. So long story short, I basically about, let's say maybe 4 or 5 years ago, somewhere in there, just really felt like I didn't care for doing private practice the conventional way. There's a lot of sort of stringing in business that you do in private practice. So I made a very conscious choice that I needed to do something different, but I didn't quite know what. So in my 20s, and I've had a lot of these, like you were describing, a lot of spontaneous kinds of shamanic experiences since a very young age. Didn't quite know what it meant. Got a lot of messages that maybe that wasn't cool, or, you know, that's probably not something you want to talk to people about. And like most people, it kind of goes underground when you get that much messaging and conditioning and things like that. So it kind of went underground until I got to graduate school. And I started having these very spontaneous experiences. And I thought, you know, I probably should figure this out, like before I'm done, you know, before I'm Dr. Somebody and diagnosing people. Mm-hmm. Because in the back of my mind, I'm like, you know, I'm seeing things that other people don't seem to see. I'm having experiences, that other people don't seem to have. So I'm not sure what to do with this. So I actually did a lot of training, and I did Reiki training. I took classes. I began studying transpersonal psychology, which, you know, talks about this stuff kind of more from a scholarly perspective. And then what I also did was some shamanic training, and had some great experiences. But at the time, you know, here I am, I'm probably in my mid to late 20s, somewhere in there. And I don't think I was psychologically mature enough to integrate this stuff in a meaningful way. And so I kind of went, all right, you know, I've had a few questions answered. This stuff is cool. I'm open to it. And I just sort of tabled it and went, well, time to go on internship. Well, time to propose the dissertation. You know, everything sort of pulled me in my, what I call IRL in real life, the mundane world, the everyday world that we all have to live in, just kind of pulled me through. And then kind of flashing forward back to, or up to probably 2006 or 7, I started having these these spontaneous kinds of shamanic experiences in sessions with patients. And at the time I was working with people, I had a lot of hospice patients. And when people are on hospice, it typically means they're like 18 months or 12 months or less expected to live. And so I think just on an intuitive level, it makes sense that these people are kind of nearing that veil or that window into the next world. It makes sense that some of these phenomena might happen. So at that point, I finally went, yeah, there's something going on here. I'm tired of wondering. I'm tired of feeling so strange and not feeling like I could talk to people about it. So I went down the path of, I'm trying to think where that really originated, but I think it was kind of whatever I found at my local witch shop, you know, kind of like whatever was on when I came in, you know, like, oh, who's that? And so I took a bunch of classes. I went to workshops. I read voraciously, got readings, got healings, you know, just tried to expose myself to as much as I could. I was very into, I was a Carmelite third order, but that's way back. At the time, though, in graduate school, right after graduate school, I went into a pretty serious study of Buddhism, Soto Zen style Buddhism. And I also was studying Ericksonian hypnosis or hypnotherapy. And one of the things that you hear a lot, and I think observe commonly in psychic groups and spiritual groups, is when people do trance work, when people are deliberately focusing their attention and being present to that focus, things happen. So my sensei, my Zen teacher, was kind of like, well, maybe you could just let that stuff go through your awareness. Like you're sitting on the riverbank and, and I thought, okay, cool. Yeah. But I started recognizing that I was getting information when I would sit down to meditate. So in other words, I'm a little bit of a failure as a Buddhist. Like, I don't think I was doing it quite right. But I do that kind of meditation quite often. And I think I've got my mind trained slightly differently in terms of its focus, so that I don't get bothered, by these sort of pesky spiritual psychic experiences. But so what that did is it really catalyzed things for me. It kind of moved me along. And then I came to Denver as life moved forward, and started back, and this was probably about right after that, maybe 2009 or something. And I jokingly say I went to Hogwarts. I went to this very intense, it was probably almost a year-long psychic development program. And I loved it. It was wonderful. It wasn't full of the, we didn't have to sort of have a lot of like a really concrete, well, now we're going into the realm of the spirits, and over here you'll see, like some people sort of with,
a
like,
guided tour.
Spiritual teachers, right? They kind of narrate, like, well, now we're in Walmart, and this is the automotive aisle, and that kind of deal. So that was cool, because that I think was very liberating, to have a teacher that was really interested in evidential stuff, like when you'd read for somebody, like a mediumistic type reading. Is the stuff that you're getting, is that being confirmed by the person whose behalf you're working? So that was really good. I think for the first time, I felt like, okay, there's a little bit of accountability here. Like, that's to the client. So I don't want to just sit there and just, and I'm seeing great figures of light and everybody's dancing around it. You kind of want to be able to tell people things that they can use that are helpful in some way. And so that really got me more focused in. And so this whole thing has been this evolution. If you looked at me in, 2010 or 11, I was doing something kind of different than what I was doing in like 2006, 2007. That every 4 or 5 years, it felt like there was sort of another iteration, another big change. And so, so finally, somewhere in all of this, I want to say 2013-ish, somewhere in there, it'd be hard to actually pinpoint, I started recognizing that I needed to do something different. I've always worked for pretty like large practices, institutional type settings. I've worked a lot in corrections. And so within that, there's, you're just always kind of working under systems. You're always working under layers of bureaucracy, and you have a certain amount of leeway within that. But, it started to feel less in alignment with what I was really into. And so I thought, but I still like what I'm doing. I love the work I do. It's meaningful. And so I thought, well, I'm going to figure this out. I'm going to have a little private practice, and I'm going to kind of see who shows up. And so I did a conventional psychotherapy practice where I did a little bit more depth work, a little bit more trance-based psychotherapy for things like, pain, sleep, phobias, stuff like that. And then the more I got into that, the more I started realizing this is really cool. Like this is where it's at. All this stuff I wasn't formally trained on in what I call graduate school was now happening, like these things you read about, the reasons people get into psychology, having big insights, being able to move symptoms more quickly through the system, things like that. I could actually see it happening with these different techniques that I wasn't really, it's not that I wasn't necessarily permitted to use them in my day job, but insurance doesn't really like to pay for Ericksonian therapy or transpersonal therapy. Right. So you have to, if you do some of those techniques in a conventional setting, I would have to say, provided psychoeducation surrounding relaxation practices. Process same. It's very clinical sounding. So it was nice to be able to just write what I needed to write and kind of proceed like that. So I'm trying to think kind of the next iteration, the next shift, the next turn of the wheel. I want to say that was approximately 2015, somewhere in there. And I'd come back from a trip to Ireland, and that's where my mom's people are all from. And I love Ireland. It's when people say it's a magical place, like I take that very literally, it is. And yet at the time I was kind of burning out. I've always had pretty high caseloads. I enjoy the work. I enjoy challenges, but hey, I'm human. We have limits, all that.
Yeah.
So I come back from that trip and I didn't feel that sense of connection that I had been kind of anticipating with the land itself, with my ancestors, with my ancestral spirits, all that jazz. And I was sort of in like how little kids like they kick dirt.
Yes.
that was kind of my energy at the time.
I just did that yesterday.
Right. You know what I'm talking about. So I show up, a friend of mine says, hey, let's go to this reading thing here. And Denver has a very active, like, metaphysical community, pagan community, all kinds of stuff, lots of shops and groups and, events going on like every weekend. So, okay, why not? So here I am, and here's a funny synchronicity. So I'm at this reading, and it's like a panel reading. So it's sort of like if you've ever been to a panel interview,
yeah.
It's
I've
like,
conducted them.
Right. And there you go. Okay.
Yep.
And I'm sitting there and I'm like, oh God, I'm roasting. They're going to roast me. So at one point during this whole thing, they're all kind of picking up on, you seem tired. You seem weary. It seems like there's something that's not quite right. So they all picked up on it. And so finally I blurted out a question and I said, you're all spot on. I said, what about shamanism? Because the word kept popping up in my mind and I couldn't quite connect it with my experiences. I knew what it was and all that stuff. I've had friends in the past that were like lineage shamans, from a specific cultural tradition, typically Native American. And so they all kind of went like this at the same time, like how dogs sort of do that kind of like, well, yeah, why wouldn't you pursue that? Why wouldn't that be, oh, okay. So I know sometimes in my day job, it's like, I just need to give somebody permission, it's like, well, of course you can ask for that. Or of course you can. So that was that for me. They all basically said, well, yeah, duh. So here's the really funny part. One of the gals that was one of that panel, I go to a drum group. I'd never been to a journey group. I kind of finessed my way in there. This friend of mine is like, yeah, let's go to this thing. And I'm like, okay, cool. I don't know what I'm doing. I show up and the teacher is like serious business. And she's, explaining the process and she's got a drum and she's a witch. And she's like, and this is how you need to have a good relationship with your spirits. And I'm like, well, yeah, okay. Yeah, cool. So she walks around and makes sure everybody's kind of cool with that. And she goes, something like, how many journeys have you done? And I'm like, well, I went to Hogwarts. I don't know what I'm doing. The Fool Tarot card. I mean, that was me. Just, just sort of leaping empty-handed into the void. Okay, yeah, journeys. Okay. So this is a lot of my life, just falling ass backwards into really interesting things, So I go to this. She's doing the drum thing. It was different than drums I'd experienced in the past. What I didn't recognize at the time was I was really going. Like I was in a very hypnotic, deep state, and I had a very powerful emotional experience. I was able to connect with a powerful dream I had many, many years prior. Suddenly, I knew what it meant. And in the dream, I'm in the backyard of my grandmother's house, my mother's side, the Irish side, and I'm just sitting there and I'm watching the house, and it's snow all over the place. And my grandmother, that whole side of the family pretty much was in the Washington, D.C. area. So I'm in D.C., in the district, grandma's house, full of snow. And there's this rumbling, like there's this sort of disruption under the surface of the snow. And up pops a cougar. a female, and
Wow.
just like arcs over the backyard, turns and looks at me and bounds away.
Wow.
So that was like years ago. And so I go into the journey and I'm in the dream. And I'm like, oh, the sleeper must awaken. And then I'm in the journey going, no, that's Dune. That's Frank Herbert. This is your subconscious, you know. So I'm having this whole kind of liminal back and forth thing within this journey. But I was hooked. I was absolutely hooked from that moment. I thought, I remember this. I remember doing this back in my 20s. I remember why I stopped. And part of why I stopped was it was too much energy. And like I said earlier, you know, psychologically, I was still doing a bunch of other things and, you know, getting in trouble with boys and all kinds of stuff. But with this, I realized like, oh, this is medicine. This is a medicine dream. It's what Jung would have called, this is a big dream. This has meaning and this has healing potential. But finally, everything sort of came together with that. And I thought, okay, this woman's my teacher. I didn't think it through. It was like, she's my teacher. So I got her info. I found her website. I became, like, you know, you might say in a different era, like an apprentice. I took all the classes for a year, very seriously studied everything she taught. And it also really returned me back to my identity as a witch. So it's not something I was super comfortable talking about publicly for a long time. I had security clearances
to get into prison and talk to
exactly. I've spent large chunks of my career in the South and in the Midwest and in the Mountain South also. And people aren't always real open to that. You know, they will quote the Bible and say things like, you know, suffer ye not a witch to live. And so I was very, very cloaked for a very long time. And so that whole experience in 2015, early 2016, just absolutely catalyzed things for me, brought me back to myself, brought me back to the path that I had just sort of detoured from for a while, you know, in graduate school. And it has been awesome. It has helped me personally a great deal. And it has really, can I say this without sounding like Frankenstein or something, like revivified, you know, kind of like charged up the private.
It's a fun word.
Isn't it? Revivify.
Yes.
You know, like we've got some, I know we've got like calipers or, you know, something like that. But that's kind of what it was for me. And a lot of things finally came together for me there in my mid 50s or mid 40s. I should say anytime I misspeak about time or whatever, my excuse is, oh, well, we work beyond space time. So, you know,
exactly.
10 years forward, 10 years back. It's all the same.
I'm impressed you have the number of dates that you were able to bring forward. I'm kind of like in the 90s and then in the 2000s, you know, and it's like, I don't know when in there. I may even be off by that. You know?
I'm in the 90s too, Megan. And I'm in the 80s sometimes.
Yeah, me too.
Know, because punk rock, right?
Yes.
But anywho.
And grunge.
And grunge. Yes, we love our grunge. You and me.
Right.
And you've got your flannel too to prove that you got the creds. So that's some of the chronology. I think I've left a few things out, but the denominator, if you will, is I've always been drawn to this stuff somehow and have fought it and have resisted it and kind of tried to make it go away. And yet here we are talking about this stuff. And it feels great to be able to do this. I think for a long time, I kind of kept myself silenced. I didn't want to be a bother. I didn't want my identities or identity or whatever bleeding into the therapy stuff, bleeding into my professorial gigs or whatever. And now I just don't give a shit. It's so liberating. It's so wonderful.
Well, and I think when you said identities, I think that, I mean, I can relate to that because I have done something very similar in terms of trying to keep my professional world separate from where my real heart desires are. Not that the professional stuff isn't fun and enjoyable for me, but I'm at the point now where it's like I'm choosing between the two, and this is what I'm choosing because it feels so much more aligned with who I am today.
I feel you. I especially resonate with that, having worked a lot in hospice, like at the end of our lives, nobody has ever said to me, "Oh, if only I had kept everything all wrapped up." Nobody ever says
I wish I would have compartmentalized more.
Nobody ever says, "I wish I'd spent all that time at the office." I wish I'd spent more time at the office. If only I had. Nobody says that. It's so important in the first half of life to carve out your place in the here and now in this world, to make your bones, make your income, do the things, all that sort of material stuff. Second half of life, especially the last part of that, it's all about love. It's all about relationship, whether it's to other people, to the self, to non-ordinary reality, to the divine, all that stuff. That's what really matters, And so that has been part of my growth process, kind of, woven through this, that what are you waiting for? What do you want? Some big pat on the head? It's time to just do what you're here to do.
Kick in the butt.
That's pretty cool. Excuse me. Yes, it kicked in the butt. Proverbial butt. Pardon my cough, by the way.
Oh, no
I had
worries.
the flu last month, so I'm still a little bit
having it. And for those of you who can see, that is like the coolest mug. I complimented it before we went live, but it's just really neat.
I think they're probably mass produced, but I dig it. It feels very substantial, like it might be magic.
Might be.
Could be magic. I could be magic.
Well,
so that's a lot of my experience.
What
that got me here?
If you don't mind my asking, and you may not want to share, but what do people say what do they talk about at the end of life? I mean, I think there's
Love.
a book out there now. So they talk about love. Do they wish? Is it more about regrets, or is it more about the things that really stand out to them in positive ways, or a combination?
Yes. Yes. You're right. It is absolutely that combination, and kind of some of the tasks of that last part of life involve coming to terms with loss and kind of strengthening or reinforcing the existing connections with other humans, usually family members. And the other thing that tends to happen with that if you talk to almost anybody that's ever worked in hospice, they will back this up on some level or another, that the spirits come for us at the end of life, that they show up. I mean, I have this happen a few times a week, typically, with people that will tell me, and they're not hallucinating, they're not having those kinds of experiences, but sometimes they'll say, I had this feeling that, or I think I saw, or I dreamt that. I mean, it comes through how it comes through. But a lot of times they'll report seeing relatives who have already been deceased, and it's really neat. It gives me sort of that, for myself personally, a sense of comfort. And I also feel that telling somebody who is at that point, that not, I don't ever say this is real, this isn't real. It's not really my job to do that. It's my job to kind of help them gently interrogate that. But to say, and I tell people this happens quite a bit. Did you know that? Because it really does. It's a very human experience. It's just in medicine and in social science and sciences, hard sciences, we haven't really caught up with that. We're still trying to kind of reduce it and break it down into, well, that's just neuronal death, or, that's just the off-gassing of the hippocampus. I think it's more than that. We are more than mere, flesh and blood and little gray cells. We're more than that. We are spirit. So
I agree.
I think that's when they show up. Yeah. So I've done that work off and on since about 2006, I think, is when I started working with elders. And it's definitely changed my perspective on death and dying, and also the fact that love is stronger than death. That was how some of those experiences, the way they came through was, I was working with somebody who's very ill. And as I'm standing there, I'm realizing I'm having some other kind of conversation in my mind's eye, not my naked eye, but it's very palpable. And I'm going, what are you doing here? It's always an ex-lover or a spouse in my experience. Every once in a blue moon, you'll get like, that's just my mileage. I think other people probably have different experiences. But in my mileage, that's who tends to show up to talk to this person. And finally, I got to a point where I basically said, hey, spirit, can you give this information to me in a way that is not as distracting? Because I was getting so distracted trying to kind of toggle back and forth and really be present for my patient and then hearing all this other stuff. So that was revelatory for me.
Yeah.
And again, very, very comforting, to know that, okay, this seems to be real. This seems to be pretty valid.
Did those experiences, I mean, since that was 2006, it was a while ago, did that influence your, just all the things that people at that stage of their life talk about? Did those things influence you do you think they influenced you as you moved forward? Is that what then inspired you to start, doing readings or get more into shamanism? Maybe that was before you really had that shamanic experience.
Right. That would have been, yeah. I think it did. I think it was all part of that, sort of this weaving together of things that had seemed so pixelated and not understandable. I started recognizing, okay, wait a second. There's some utility here. This could make some corn grow, so to speak. If I develop this a bit, I can help people more, or just differently, maybe in ways that are positive for them. So yeah, it's very much been a part and parcel of that whole experience. And there's so many good writers out there. There's so many bad writers out there, but there's so many good writers out there. And everybody points out at some point, it seems, that on some level, this stuff comes for us. You can say, okay, I want to have a lot of very strong intuitive experiences. I want to have these kinds of visionary things happening, and then you undertake it. That's cool, and I think everybody can do that stuff. I think every human being has that capacity for visionary experience, for direct revelation, that kind of stuff. I think that there are some folks that it's sort of like it's just pesty. It's pesty. I'm not going to try to tart it all up and say, oh, it's so nice to be chosen or something. I don't know. To be really blunt about it, this stuff has been kind of a pain in the ass for a lot of my life, because I felt like I don't want this information. I'm here to be a social scientist. I'm here to, be a clinician, and I'm here to kind of measure things and carve things up and make things more understandable. At least that's what I thought I was supposed to be doing. That's just not what happened. And so my whole process was one of surrender. And all right, okay, I guess we're just going to have to roll with this part of it. This is the part I've been avoiding. Like doing meditation, that has always felt very natural. Praying has always felt very natural. I was raised Catholic. I was a third order Carmelite. I was actually having very shamanic experiences at the time, or mystical experiences, if you will. And
yay!
But it was all sort of cloaked in this religious stuff. And none of that ever came together for me completely, And so a lot of my development as a human being, I think, has been trying to find places to put this part of myself, And so Witch and Bitch started that in the fall of last year. That has been a place for me where I can just talk about stuff, and nobody's going to think I'm nuts. And I don't think I'm nuts, and I don't think anybody there is nuts, and nobody's going to invalidate that. But where we can also talk about like real world stuff, that's kind of what I'm really interested in over the last several years, not just with my day job, but with this part of my life, is just trying to help, just trying to use your powers for good, use your little intuitive inklings and leanings and stuff to help. So that's the mashup there. That's Justine's mashup in a nutshell. Did you want me to talk about any part of that in particular?
But I have some.
Are there things? Oh, go ahead, Santa.
I do have some questions. I'm not sure if I'll remember all of them, and my notes are fairly visible to me. So I'm going to go by memory, which can be, tricky for me. Um, One of the things, something that came to me when you were talking, and I don't know if you're ready to say this, or maybe you never will be ready to say this, so take it for what it's worth. But when you were talking about Witch and Bitch and how that is a place where you can do good, and it seems to me like it's really important to you to have an action aspect to your life. It's not all theory. You have to do stuff. And I wonder if Witch and Bitch in some way represents some element of transition for you. Not that you're necessarily looking to give up on your practice, but it seems the things you do in there is very different than what you do in your regular practice in some ways, yet still very action oriented.
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it. Yeah. It's a place where we have ceremony. I love to drum. Cast magic circles, protective circles. We do a little bit of a polite hexing of the patriarchal systems that need hex. And we're going to have a retreat, to get together like on ground in April and make magic and be a source of light for ourselves that we can carry out into the world as a collective. And so I forgot to mention earlier, I was trained as a community clinical psychologist. And so I really like communities. The upshot of that is community itself, it has the power to heal.
What is a community clinical psychologist? Does that mean?
So the origin of that was against the medicalization of mental illness as well as psychology. So back in the 60s, when Kennedy deinstitutionalized folks, just sort of opened the doors to these institutions, it was thought that community systems would then be activated and that these people who had been basically incarcerated for psychiatric reasons, often for very poor psychiatric reasons, would then be able to heal and make progress. And so there were some really cool experiments back then in the 60s and 70s, particularly on the East Coast, with that stuff and using community resources, using groups, using get-togethers, using churches, using civic organizations, having these people live in community rather than in an institution. So sometimes they would all live like in a group home or just a more normal kind of a setting. And that's good stuff. I mean, there are certain things that we still need medications for when it comes to kind of severe and persistent mental illness. But community is so healing for people. We human beings, and this sounds a bit reductionistic, but we are pack animals. We are social animals. We need people when we're young and when we're older, especially to help us regulate, to help us learn how to calm and soothe ourselves, how to connect in safe ways with one another. And so unfortunately, though, by the time of the sort of, I don't know if I want to call it the Prozac revolution, but kind of, which we needed, we needed a lot better antidepressants. That has kind of fallen by the wayside. So by the time I went to graduate school, which was like early 90s, we were like one of the last. I think we were one of 2 community clinical programs in the country.
Really?
Yeah. And it's interesting, talk about getting kind of swept up in things and your conditioning kicking in. By the time I hit my internship year, which was like 97, 98, which was in a medical type environment, the faculty had shifted, the emphasis was not the same. But in my heart of hearts, like that's where my heart is, it's in the power of the group. It's in the power of the collective. When we take our practices and we put them together and we share, I think that's when we really get somewhere. I think that's where the magic happens.
Yeah.
And without getting too esoteric about it, there's some beautiful, lovely parallels between how group therapy can really help people and then how just a spiritual community can help people. They're not the same thing, but there's some really cool parallels. And I think so much of, when I look at like, if I were to just sort of step back for the last almost 30 years, I've been doing clinical work and look at what are the things that that help people? What are the things that help people grow? What are the things that help people heal? What are the things that help people grieve? All these types of things. It has to do with connection. It has to do with relationship. And it's taken me a long time to kind of tie all this stuff together just in my own head. But I'm just a firm believer in that. And then when we feel sad, when we feel overwhelmed, when we feel disconnected, when we feel unseen, when we feel unheard, those things can be very, very traumatic. Community can help with that. You can be seen, you can be heard, you can be held, so to speak, energetically. So that's kind of my deal. That's kind of how I'm leaning these days, you know.
Well, it's really cool. I just wanted to mention one of the comments that just came through says, I think psychiatric treatment should happen in nature, not inside the gray walls of an institution.
Hell yes. Hell yes. I don't know who said that, but you're right. You are right. Every chance I get.
Yeah.
And I jokingly refer to, I work in several different facilities during the week, and I jokingly call them like Shady Pines or Piney Pines or something like that. But
you mean they're really not called that?
I know. It's crazy. What was I thinking? But it's sort of like whenever I show up at one of my Piney Pines, and if the weather's good, I love to take my people outside, if at all possible. Because for one, I'm just on a very, very mundane level. Most of us don't get enough vitamin D.
Yeah.
And we know that helps mood. We know it helps bones. It helps so many things. But whoever wrote that, and for some reason I can't pull this up right now. Tina Garino. Oh, sorry. I hope I didn't ruin your broadcast just now, but
no, she's cool with my sharing her name.
Oh, good.
Unless that changes, but
sorry. Hello, Tina. But yes, it has a good effect on people. Just that alone, something as simple as taking somebody outside for 20 minutes.
Yeah.
You know, going out to the courtyard and just looking at the trees and the plants and, you know, stuff like that. Absolutely.
It's expansive. Yeah.
It is. It enlarges the soul. And when we do that, when we kind of embiggen, in a Simpsons term, our sense of ourselves in that regard, not like we're so great and all puffed up, but was it Walt Whitman that said, I am vast, I contain multitudes, or I am large, I contain multitudes, something like that. When you can really do that, you can access more parts of yourself.
Yeah.
And when we can do that, we can fix a lot of stuff and we can heal.
Yes.
And that's absolutely right. I mean, I wouldn't want to try to have some big revelatory experience of sitting in most day rooms I've been in most institutional facilities. Just doesn't mesh. The aesthetics are just not there. But
exactly.
There is something just profoundly healing. And there's interesting research coming out now. And of course, right this second, I can't think of who's doing the research, but how nature really does, like you can actually kind of measure this. Like you can have a control group that doesn't get nature time. Now you have the experimental group that gets less, you know, you can see some really interesting differences. And music, gardening is amazing for people. Just making something grow, you know, creating conditions for growth.
It's so nice to have, you know, it's not there yet maybe, but that they're starting to recognize that people in long-term care facilities are still alive.
Yes, very much so. Very much so. And you're so dead on, because that is part of the disconnect that people feel is I've had so many people tell me, I can even see this within myself, especially since I started letting my hair do its natural thing.
Looks
that it wants
awesome,
to do.
By the way.
Stick straight up and be gray. Thank you. It's, you know, they'll tell me, I feel like I'm 30. You know, and they'll say, I can't believe, what is all this? You know, what's going on with my face? Why am I in this wheelchair?
Yeah.
And it's that that is, for some people, not everybody, but for some folks, that can be a little traumatic, because it's like my insides just apparently aren't seen. I feel this way, but nobody seems to be acknowledging that.
Yeah.
You know, and so yes, I do think that there is that misconception that people go into long-term care facilities to die.
Yeah.
It's not true. It's oftentimes more just nobody can take care of them. They got many good years left. Mm-hmm. And then the task is existential. It's trying to figure out, what's the purpose? What's the point?
Yes.
What is the meaning going to be? What are the things that you're going to put into your life or add into your life that that are important at this point and valuable to you. So that is a lot of that work itself with that age group is very existential. And I think we can also make a case that it's spiritual too, because those are the big questions, you know.
I'm really curious about your time working in prisons and in treatment facilities and things like that. Were you at that time still getting messages, or, or were you more, because those environments, I'm really curious about if you were attracted to those environments, or is that just where you ended up? and, and I know I'm bombarding you with questions, but the other one is, regardless, in there, as an intuitive, I don't know what level, if you're an empath, if you consider yourself an empath, if you believe in empaths, but I know personally going into that environment, I was just complaining about going to my daughter's taekwondo belt test with a bunch of people in a small contained space and having mini anxiety attacks. I can't imagine what it would be like in a prison or, a place where people are healing or maybe not, and, or who are really incredibly challenged in one way, shape, or form.
That is a great question, Senator, and I'm very glad you asked me that. So where do I start with that? So this is going to sound a little strange, but hey, it's a mystical mashup, right? So here's the mash. When I was a kid, I loved murder mysteries. Like, I was raised on Agatha Christie. I was raised on, oh my gosh, Ruth Rendell, and what are the other writers? So many good writers. Because my mother loves that stuff. And I just sort of fell into it. So I've always been fascinated, and I love puzzles. I love challenges. And so I'm always kind of like, ooh, who done it? Even when I watch things when I'm doing, I shouldn't say this probably, but like when I'm doing other things, but I'm watching TV. I love those true crime shows, stuff like that. And when I started graduate school, my actual line of interest was forensic psychology. And I've kind of come back to that a few times as a instructor and whatnot. So my first couple of years were all about, I really wanted to work with severely and persistently mentally ill folks, as well as the forensic population. And what I found was that there's lots of stuff that connects to both of those interest areas. And so I think it was my end of my second year. It's kind of ironic. I was at a faculty big Christmas party. I don't know what the hell, that would have been second year. Anyway, somewhere in there. What were you just saying about I have good memory for dates? It's all gone now, Megan. It's all gone. But somewhere in there, a faculty member approached me as I'm drinking a beer and says, "Hey, would you like to work in a halfway house for chemically dependent women?" And I'm like, because you're in graduate school and you're all frazzled all the time. You're being evaluated all the time. So I'm like, I'll just put that right down.
I was just holding this for a friend.
This isn't my beer. Never saw it before. So I did that and I loved it. I love working in addictions, and I did that for a long time. Probably, I was trying to figure that out the other day. Probably a total of almost 8 years. And part of why I liked it so much is because people get better.
Yeah.
And purely selfish motives, like, wow, that's really nice for people to get better and to see people's lives coming back together. Most of the facilities I've worked at, we would have like alumni come back and, give a little talk, or there's some little ceremonies we would have and all that kind of stuff. And to really see people, having seen them come in and then seeing them come totally different. So I just loved it. I loved it. And it was a very loving environment to work in by and large. And in substance abuse treatment, there's a long history of spiritual stuff, like the Oxford movement, which gave way to the 12-step movement, which if you talk to anybody that's been in AA more than about a year, they will tell you this is a purely spiritual program because it's all about you and something you can't control. It's all about you and something way bigger than you. And so coming from a very, very Catholic background and having some understanding of grace and how that can help people begin to heal, just holding a little bit of grace for themselves, giving themselves a little bit of wiggle room, a little bit of permission to be human. That was good stuff right there. And so at the end of, I cannot quite recall, think it was after my internship year somewhere, like very late 90s. That was when I started working in corrections. And I was a rugby player in college. I'm going to go backwards for a second. I was a rugby player in college.
That's a great introduction to that.
I gotta work on my brand. Anyway,
Context, right?
Context, yes. I was a rugby player. I did a lot of martial arts growing up. I'm a very sturdy woman, So I didn't feel, and this may sound a little arrogant or cocky, but I didn't feel physically very scared in those places just because I knew I could handle myself physically.
Were they predominantly male or female correction facilities?
Mostly male.
Okay,
I've only worked in 1.5 kind of facility. One was all female, and one was like a detention kind of a deal with like a jail with females. So, yeah, wow. And I just really enjoyed the excitement. I know that sounds wild, but there is a lot of excitement. There's long periods of boredom where nothing happens, and then woo, shit breaks off, and it's very exciting. There's also a lot of intrigue. I mean, it suited me. I liked figuring out the plots that were going on. And why is this happening? And that kind of stuff. The other thing that was kind of like, you asked about, did I get hits, like intuitive hits? Mm-hmm. Yes. Mm-hmm. But I had to stifle them considerably. Because you don't want to run around, especially like a maximum security facility.
Just visualizing that. Very profound way.
Any spirit beings that would like to speak to me, come forward. Well, I don't know about that. I would do it like nowadays. What I would obviously say is like, any spirit being who is benevolent towards humans, any spirit being who is kind and compassionate. So yeah, that was me.
That's where that came from. That really has helped me when you do that. That I started adopting that as well. So yeah, just a little side note, but
sometimes it's those nuances,
Yeah, it's an important one.
But the other, right. The other thing, and this is going to sound kind of funny, but here we have it, is in facilities where I had an office, I had warding. I had any kind of door jamb, like the what's that called? The lintel on top of the door. I would always have something that for me was protective, like a holy card of Saint Dymphna, who is the patron saint of mental illness. And it was kind of in part like blessing, like people that come in here, this is my intention. I want them to be healed. I want things to go better for them. I want their behaviors to be better also. You need to act right. It's a lot of my job, and in those environments, a lot of the job is pointing things out that people are not doing very well, or that really aren't in anybody's best interest. So it's kind of a blend. You kind of got to have a bit of a protected energy to the space you're in. You have to move in those spaces and those environments with what we used to call that on the swivel kind of awareness, like the totality of the circumstances. So whenever I would go into a facility where I know there's violent people in here, it was sort of like I would kind of open up, just by thinking about it, just by focusing on it, the back part of my energy field. Because if it's stuff I can see, that's great, but I don't know what's behind me. So there's also interesting research on that. Can I remember who did it right now? No. About we all do kind of have a sense, like they've tested some things that people can kind of tell, when there's somebody behind it, even if it's at a pretty considerable distance, that kind of stuff. I did a lot of that.
I could totally see the need.
Oh yeah. I mean, So there were times when I would be sitting and I did a lot more kind of assessment work and diagnostic work in those places, but I also did a fair amount of therapy. And sometimes I would just sort of get almost just a flash, just sort of in my mind's eye, like, what is it? I don't know what that is. And I would just question them in a gentle, not in sort of a, who's that guy standing there kind of a way, but like, because, they don't let you be a psychologist if you do stuff like that. So, I would just say, hey, I'm curious about, has anybody recently passed away in your family? And, kind of go at it through that that kind of a lens. And that's typically what would happen. Every once in a while that I would get information about traumas that the person had experienced. But it's, for the most part, I was pretty much in my mundane, ordinary state of consciousness when I was in those environments.
Well, I have two questions, and you can choose which one to answer or answer both. One is, how did you know to ward yourself or to create those wards? And the other is, this is a perspective question, did you find,
It's a good question.
In terms of people who are incarcerated, did you find that a fair number were sensitive to, they wouldn't necessarily run around and say they see ghosts either, but more sensitive, like empathic types, or that they've shut all of that down or absolutely are not sensitive to anything? I've just always been curious about that.
That is how much time do we have? That's a really good question.
We still have, what, 25 minutes?
Oh my God. Okay. Wow, this is flying by.
They always do.
I'm trying to think of the best way to frame that. I can say yes. Yes, there are definitely people in correctional facilities all over this country that didn't do it. I mean, there are innocent people that get locked up. That's just how the system works. That sure, definitely had some intuitive gifts. And of course, I believe also there were people that I worked with that had some intuitive gifts, but were making very bad conscious choices with those, to manipulate others, to predate upon them. There's a fair amount of that in the prison system, just baseline. But that's a really good question. I don't know if I have an answer to that. I don't know that I was attending as much to that stuff back then, but I can also tell you one of the factors that rolls right into criminal behavior, violent behavior, all that stuff is I don't think I've ever met, maybe I have, but it doesn't seem like it was very often, meeting with folks and you scratch them a little bit, like if they'll kind of let you in and you can get more of their social history, there's almost always trauma, always trauma. And when you have males, especially, that have not had corrective emotional experiences, have not been able to bond, to get help, have formed secure bonds with people, have healthy relationships with people, it just gets worse and worse and worse. That's where a lot of the gang stuff comes in, because if you've come from a home where there's a lot of abuse or trauma, and the gang likes you as you are, all you got to do is, some jobs, put in some work or whatever. That underscores a lot of stuff.
Well, it kind of goes back to what you were saying about people needing other people, needing community, and that whole thing around, acceptance, but also that, I've heard people, not firsthand, but, in documentaries or movies, is saying that, they're like family to them. Mm-hmm. And it's so I've just always had this sense that people who are sensitive and do experience trauma but don't exactly know what things that are going on around them, what they mean, and are rejected by other people, that sometimes they can lead to, people running away, but also maybe doing other things that are counterproductive. Not always, of course. It depends on circumstances and how the person interprets what's going on around them, and all of those many, many, many different factors. But that sensitivity piece has always been with me. In terms of all kinds of contexts.
Oh yeah. That I'm kind of I don't know how to pronounce this, asterisking this, because I want to come back to that at some point, whether it's today or some other time, because man, that is a great question, and I need to sit and think more about it.
Okay.
Because I do think when people have trauma of any kind, typically it does tend to sensitize them. It certainly sensitizes the nervous system, the autonomic nervous system in particular, and parasympathetic nervous system, so that it's harder to kind of rest and digest. Yeah. It's harder to kind of de-escalate and feel safe and secure and calm. And, traumatic responses are fight, fright, freeze basically, you know, or flee. So, or fawn. That's the latest one. That's a whole other thing.
I haven't heard of that one.
But yes, fawning. So yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. I just hadn't ever looked at it through that lens. So yeah, I will.
Cool.
Though.
All right, good. I can't wait to hear what you come up with. Okay, so then you said you had warded your office, especially when you had that. How did you know? I mean, I know you had background to some extent, but did it just come to you like, I need to protect this space, or I need to really watch my back, and more beyond the physical, you know?
I'm finding I'm scrolling backwards in time now, trying to figure out, when did I start? What was the earliest I did that? And I realized it was, I think, my 4th year of graduate school, and I was working in a community based mental health center. And I just had a relationship, what I consider a working relationship, like a spiritual relationship with certain saints and archangels and that kind of stuff. And it just seemed very natural to me to do that. It's very common with certain types of folk Catholicism to use the power of the saints, if you will, to direct energy. And so in the home I grew up in, I mean, I had the goddess on my dresser. You know, I had Mary there, and I had my Palm Sunday fronds, and I had my little Sacred Heart prayer card somewhere on my bulletin board. And, you know, there's a lot of stuff that goes into being raised Catholic, you know, and I see sometimes when people talk about Catholics being a little bit idolatrous and things like, you know, we got a lot of stuff. We like stuff. Rosaries, different types of prayers for different occasions. So to me, that just felt like an extension of that.
Sure.
You know, it just seemed very natural. Like, oh, this is a creepy place. Well, I'm going to put an exorcism medal in my drawer. You know, I'm going to make sure I have a nice little image over there of St. Michael the Archangel tucked into the corner of this whiteboard, or, you know, something like that. So Catholic superstition, I can boil it down to that.
I love that. And, you know, so here I am with a couple of different questions that are, one will take us to past and the other might be past into present. So I'll let you choose again. How about that? One is, I'm curious about the third Carmelite tertiary, or, you know, a third order. I'm curious about how you chose to do that, and how did you decide to leave? You know, what happened? What led to your choice to not continue to pursue it? But then the other question, completely different. And if you forget, that's fine. I just want to, then if I go back to the replay, I can remember what I'd asked.
Okay.
The other one is, have you always, have you ever, or do you currently do things to, do you have like an energetic routine? Do you have something where you, like after you leave work or in preparation for going to work, do things from that perspective?
Oh, I will definitely. Yeah. I got a lot on that second one, especially. Okay. So I'll answer the first part about what got me into the Carmelites and what got me out of the Carmelites. So in my, again, the exact
worry about the dates.
year, I can't remember, but I got really into contemplative prayer, which is also called centering prayer sometimes. Thomas Keating really pioneered that stuff. And if you kind of go back in like American Catholic theology, you find yourself back with, was it Fulton J. Sheen? No, I'm sorry, not Fulton J. Sheen. Thomas Merton, who wrote The 7-Story Mountain. Thomas Merton was a fascinating guy. I want to say he was a Jesuit. And I think had he lived, he would have really helped us form a better understanding of and a more integrated practice of centering prayer. Because at the time of his death, I think he died, it was in, I can't remember what part of Asia, but he was really he was interfacing with lots of folks from the contemplative Buddhist traditions and different other types of traditions, and realizing what, Aldous Huxley talked about, kind of like that perennial philosophy, that at the heart of everything, every spiritual tradition is an esoteric core. And pretty much almost every major spiritual tradition has a very similar esoteric core. And so he was really in the process of trying to kind of introduced the West, to these practices when he died. And depends on who you talk to, maybe he was killed and all, I don't know. But so that stuff, growing up, my mother in particular always had lots of books about that stuff. And so I always kind of had this awareness that there was such a thing as like a cloistered life, which was basically just resting in the presence of God. I mean, he did a lot of other shit too, but that was the gist of it, being present to the Holy Presence. And I loved it. And when I was in graduate school and I would go practice contemplative prayer, started having very sort of psychical experiences. And when you grow up in that kind of, even though I had a good, liberal arts education and everything, this is different. This lives in a different part of you, lives in the soul. And so I was having what I now know were very shamanic experiences, very visionary kinds of experiences, going to other places and feeling things that, how did I know that, and all that kind of jazz. And so I thought in my, how old was I, 23, 24-year-old brain or whatever, I thought that, well, this means that I probably should pursue a more monastic life, or I should, be part of a religious order where that's part of the deal. And so did a lot of searching and soul searching, and St. Teresa of Avila is my patron saint. And she was a Carmelite, because I just thought she was a badass. She was basically, she was considered a doctor of the church. And, like, who doesn't like power? Who doesn't like aligning themselves with somebody powerful, in spirit? And so I thought, yeah, cool. I dig her, the interior castle. My father's house has many mansions, all that good stuff. Yeah. And so I read all that. And I'm like, all right, this is it for me. So what got me out of that was they weren't contemplative enough, the lay order that I joined. And I have to have a sidebar here. It probably is a little tough to picture me kind of like, some kind of holy roller or whatever. I was an utter flop. I mean, I really sucked, like bad as a Carmelite. Oh no. I'd show up with my red lipstick, and, it was like the early mid 90s. I had big old, woo hair kind of stuff. I'm on all the foul mouth punk rock shit. I was always wearing black and cussing, and I don't think I didn't know what to do with me. I didn't know what to do with them. I liked these people a lot. I thought they were very cool, good-hearted people. But it was not exactly what I needed. I stuck with it as long as I could. But it was very dry, and it wasn't, this is going to sound so critical, but like the people that were, by and large, kind of in that, not everybody, but a huge chunk, and it was kind of the vibe of the group. It was very sweet Jesus in me. It was very solipsistic. It was very, well, only my truth matters, and my personal relationship. Everybody else, whatever, And that's not where my heart lies. That's not where I'm at. And so ultimately I pieced out, and that was cool, and they were cool, and it was fine. But, well, yeah, I learned a lot of cool stuff. I did.
Sounds like it.
And then, yes, I did. And sometimes I think learning what you're not interested in or what's not going to work for you ultimately it's not more valuable. So you asked about a routine.
Yeah.
And that has morphed and changed a lot. Early in my career, and this is true, I think, of a lot of people that work in helping professions, it's hard to have boundaries around, oh my God, what do I do with my worry about this person who just left my office? What do I do with my fear? What do I do with my concern? Because I'm not going to be back here for another week, and that kind of thing. So back then, somewhere in my practicum training, I started doing kind of this, it was almost like, it was very mechanical. It was sort of like I would picture this very brilliant white cloud kind of descending, this energy cloud kind of descending from heaven, and just like buzzing off anything that didn't need to be, kind of like a burr, kind of a thing. And to me, it always appeared like it had little diamond fragments in it. And so I'd hop in my car, and I would just sort of call this down and say, please help. That was basically my energy practice. Like, just please, because I'm all worried. And I've already talked to my supervisor, and he's telling me it's okay, but I'm still really worried, and I don't want to worry about this all weekend. And so that's kind of how that started, just for me, just so I could manage my own distress.
Yeah.
So I've had versions of that ever since. One of the things I do, and sometimes I do it at the individual level, but more commonly nowadays I do it because I work in facilities oftentimes, is I will just mentally affirm that all my energy returns to me now perfectly. And sometimes I'll put some flowery stuff like in perfect healing colors and tones, and that person or that facility's energy returns to them now in perfect healing colors and tones, or something along those lines. Because that's a gentle way of doing it. We're not calling it a cosmic buzzsaw, to
Right.
buff right, like a chainsaw or something. So I do that. And in the mornings, I try to do this most mornings. I haven't done it a whole lot lately because I haven't been feeling very well, but is I like to drum the sun up and get up early and talk to the East and the benevolent spirits of the East and begin my day that way, because I feel like it's intentional and it's mindful for me to start things like that. I also can tell you on days when I drum, I feel better. Days when I don't drum, I don't sometimes. And it has a very powerful effect, whether I'm working on behalf of someone else or I'm just drumming or I'm leading ceremony or whatever. It tends to, some of the current thinking is that, and this is pretty collapsed information, but that it really kind of integrates the activity of both sides, both hemispheres of the brain. We think that when that's happening, it's kind of like what maybe I was talking about before, with having more of yourself available, feeling more, just a feeling of wholeness. So I dig it because of that. I just like to sit and drum, so that's generally a part of it. I also have a little rattle sometimes if my energy is just sort of, and I've got some shoulder and hand issues that sometimes make drumming a little less appealing. I'll do just a rattle, kind of not even a ceremony, but just as a practice. I like to take spiritual baths. Moreover, I like to take spiritual showers because our bathtub is kind of squishy, so I love to do that. And I like to do, the older I've gotten, the less stuff I bring into this usually. Like when I was younger, I had to have this kind of soap and I had to have that kind of thing. And I had to burn this, but only facing this direction, kind of a little overly ritualized. And now I'm more like, all right, here's my intention. All this water that's hitting me is washing away anything that does not belong to me and is revivifying me. It's making me feel energized and loving. And, I'll even kind of say I'm a force for good in this world, or, something like that, excuse me, to just kind of, it's almost like energetic hygiene. It's like brushing your teeth or something, So there's that. That's I'd say on days I don't drum, like I'm doing that typically for myself. I love to light stuff on fire. I love fire as an element. I love air as an element. And I like to, I've got all sorts of things. I've been trying to get away from things over time that I suspect are not sustainably harvested. So, but sometimes I will still light a little bit of white sage, some Palo Santo, frankincense, cedar, mugwort, a few other things, because I am an Aquarian with a Gemini moon, and if I don't do stuff like that, if I don't have a grounded practice, I will float away. Like, the balloon head on the tether is like, oh, what's all this over here? Because everything's so interesting. So for me to be able to focus and that kind of stuff, I really have to do something sensory. I have to do something that keeps my awareness like right here.
Yeah.
So there's that. And then in Witch and Bitch, there's a lot of crystal lovers, and there's a lot of people that are into their rocks and stones and crystals. And so I've learned a lot from the crew in there. And so I just started getting back into a little bit of that. And for me, it's usually as simple as like, here's a really groovy little labradorite I just have sit in front of me. Like a worry stone sometimes. It just kind of keeps my awareness, more grounded. So stuff like that. I'm pretty basic.
Well, that's super cool. I love hearing those types of how, you've just integrated these things into your life, and it seems like a natural thing to do. And I think sometimes for people just starting out, they don't think about it because it's not front and center. But I
Right.
find that when I do those types of routines, and there's a couple of different things, kind of like you, depending on the situation, I don't drum, but I am very audio. And so anything like even just singing in the car helps me a lot. Yesterday, I had a weird day
Ooh.
and I screamed at the top of my lungs, probably louder than I ever have, which was really an interesting experience for me because I'm really not that kind of person who does that. I've never done the
No.
primal scream thing. Movement was not something I was a part of. And I just was like, and I've done like the kind of frustration scream, but this was like amplified. Thank goodness it was winter because
Ooh.
I can't do it with the windows down, but it was louder than I've ever done. And I have to say, my throat feels better having done that. It was
Yeah.
sore for about a minute or two. And then now it's like, wow, I really released something there. And
Yes.
and it's like, well, that is not a normal practice of mine. But at the same point, I just think that the things that we can collect are really, and I seriously think now I'm starting to recognize residual energy. Like even
Ooh.
just things that may have popped up even last year around this time that seems to be surfacing, but just in an energetic level where it's like, well, that's interesting that I'm now thinking of that. That's really, wow, where did that come from? And so it's like,
Cool.
to me, it makes it even more imperative in some cases to do those energetic exercises. Because if we've got all this residual energy hanging out and I haven't really considered it before, how awesome would this place be if I actually cleared it in a deeper
Yes.
level?
That's cool. That's
Well,
way cool. When you talked about the sort of that almost a primal kind of a scream, there's a lot of very sort of like esoteric kind of metaphysical philosophies that talk about how sound is such a key part of creation itself. That the first there was nothing, and then there was like the word. I think that's the biblical version of
it
that.
sounds like it.
And so yes, and so sound, this makes so much sense to me. If drumming and rattling can tone the energy systems in the body, and I also think it works through the nervous system, particularly the autonomic parasympathetic nervous system, that makes a lot of sense to me that a scream, because that is sound, that is vibration, could move some energy around, could do
Yeah.
some cool stuff. I joke sometimes about how the drum, when you listen to that very rhythmic, shamanic driving kind of a drum, you're sort of manually like
Oh
unscrewing,
my
let's say,
gosh.
the crown chakra. It's like you don't have to sort of do it in a very abstract, all right, now I'm visualizing. It's like, oh no, you can't not pay attention to that. It's right there.
For sure.
Okay, here we go. Yes, it focuses that energy and the energetic kind of response that we have. I think that's awesome. I'm having a hard time picturing you doing that,
Well,
Megan.
I am too, but I did it and I'm like, I don't,
I love it.
yesterday was just a weird day, but it was so weird that I'm like, this isn't my normal behavior. Almost the whole day was like that. And I'm like, I don't know what's going on, but I'm going to scream. So,
Yeah.
I was on my way to the mall. Best to get it out in the car, and so
Yes. Yes. Oh my gosh. Absolutely. I think sometimes it's like one of the easiest ways to release tension.
yeah.
I do it probably once a week in my
Well,
car,
I
just
can't.
driving.
I may do it more now. I can't do it at home because it freaks our dogs out. They think something's wrong and then they start shaking. And it's like I
Oh,
don't want to traumatize
little
our puppies
babies.
just because I've got to let some screaming out. They also freak out when I dance, but that's a whole other reason probably. I swear I don't dance like Elaine in Seinfeld, but I feel like it when the dogs are like, ah.
Oh my, like freaking out. It's a full body throw up. I love that. I love that episode.
Me too. One
Oh,
of my
that's
favorites.
great. So yeah, it like dispels tension,
Yeah.
just to be able to emit that kind of just raw sound. And in a shamanic state of consciousness, we would probably observe that you're opening something up, like
Mm.
you're busting up the molecules of reality. So hopefully something
Ooh,
new and better can come through,
good.
you
Maybe
know?
that's why I was
Um,
so compelled to do it. It's time for
yeah.
that.
Oh yeah. I like that. Like a sonic weapon. It's fascinating to me how much, when we use metaphors to talk about trauma, when we use
Mm.
metaphors to talk about healing, how much of it we talk about things like resonance, we talk about
Yeah.
vibration, sometimes we talk about like I'm thinking right now of like military PTSD, when people have been like with these pressure waves and shock waves that are rattling their literal brain around, and the nervous system, of course, that's connected. So it makes
Earthquakes
so
can
much
do that too,
sense.
to some extent.
Earthquakes. Oh, yes, absolutely. I think there's a reason why dogs hide during, you know, massive thunderstorms and things like that. So I think there's some good precedent for that, you know, for using sound
Yeah.
as almost like a technology, if you will, for healing. I think that, I'm just trying to picture you in your Santa hat. That's where I'm getting stuck.
Well, I wasn't wearing that yesterday, but
your elf hat.
no, but if I can think, if I have the presence of mind, maybe I will record it next time, just so you can get the visual. You know?
I would like you to do that, actually. And
probably not very pretty, though. You know, it's like,
powerful,
could be
right?
scary. Yeah.
Real and raw. That's good stuff.
Nice.
Let's see. I had a couple of notes. Did I answer things that you got? I think I have.
I think so.
Oh, yeah, the routine stuff. And then at the end of the day, you know, I always used to say my prayers. You know, that's a very Catholic schoolgirl sort of a habit, you know. And I don't do that a whole lot anymore, but usually what I just say, thank you. You know, like, thank you for everything I have. Thank you for my health. Thank you for this day. Thank you for being there. Thank you for listening. Thank you for putting up with my bullshit, because I'm back on it. You know, whatever that is, that's usually it. I'm pretty stripped down at this. I'm like a I don't know, a Toyota Cressida from 1987 or something. I'm kind of, you know,
that is so
manual.
I just have to tell you, you brought up the car that is what my grandparents drove. Like one of my sets of grandparents, they had two Cressidas, and I remember it really well, because when I would visit them when they were older, I would drive it, and I don't know, my grandmother was a two-footed driver, which means one foot on the gas and the other on the brake, and she had depth perception issues, and driving with her was scary. Scary. So I would try to drive, but I'm like, well, this car handles really weirdly, and that I'm moving the steering wheel and nothing is happening. This is so fun. But
oh, yeah,
that grandmother has been paying me a lot of visits lately. Her name was Ruth, and then my other grandma's name was Alice. And both of them often, seriously, for like several weeks now, any program I watch or if I'm reading something, the people they use as examples or characters are either named Alice or Ruth. And I'm like, those names are not that common anymore, and I'm hearing them pretty much daily. And I'm like, hi, Grandma, hi, Grandma. So you're bringing up the Toyota Cressida is kind of like, well, maybe Grandpa's around now, too. Cool. So.
That's awesome, because I could not say Cressida. I wanted to say Corolla.
Oh.
And I'm like, no, this is like a generation before the Corolla, you know, was commonplace. The Cressida. Did any of your grandmas like yell a little? Just a little?
Well, my
like,
one...
emphatic, like, Cressida.
I can see my grandma Ruth doing that, who's the one who owned her and my grandpa. And the reason I say that is grandma had red hair when in her prime. She had Lucille Ball hair and very stylish. And
wow.
You know how Lucille Ball used to kind of go, wah? Well, grandma would go, Ed, like to my grandpa, and it was like she didn't yell. It wasn't her scene, but she would have this kind of projection, or like, well, okay, now I'm telling the world my nickname from my grandparents, but Magoo, you know, and stuff like that. They
That's
just
so sweet.
Come out, and she just had this very Lucille Ball style about her. I don't think she actually meant to emulate her, but there's now in my memory that is kind of how she was.
What a character! I love it.
Yeah,
oh, that's cool.
Yeah,
huh.
She was pretty.
It's always
awesome.
Funny how that stuff happens, you know. I dig it. I love it.
Well, dear, we have passed our hour-and-a-half mark. Can you believe it? I know.
I'm all flustered.
These conversations tend to go incredibly fast. So
yeah.
I just want to thank you so much for taking the time to come on and to mash it with me and share your story, aspects of your story, answer my off-the-wall questions, and to encourage more screaming. I love that.
Yes. Highly recommend.
Yes.
Highly recommend.
I'm kind of bummed we didn't hear your dogs.
You're what now?
Oh, I said, I'm kind of bummed we didn't hear your dogs. I was expecting them to chime in.
I, I was too. I am a little. Now I'm. Oh no,
Now
she's
you're,
right there.
oh,
Okay,
good.
I get a little suspicious when I don't hear things. Like where's everybody? Thank you so much for having me. This has been really fun, and I just think what you're doing here is so cool and educational and informative and lighthearted. I love it.
Thank you. Well, I think what you're doing is really cool too. I'd love to have you on again, maybe talk about some things topically. One
Sure.
person had left a comment, I feel a primal screaming class coming up. That would be a really interesting one to record.
Yes. Oh yeah.
That could
Maybe
go
we'll do that
viral.
at the retreat.
There you go.
I think that's kind of forming now. Yeah,
There you
definitely.
go. Ooh,
Thank you.
wow.
Thank you so
All
much.
right.
This has
Well,
been my pleasure.
mine too. And so what I'm going to do is I would like to create a unit. I haven't decided what to call it in the Facebook group so that we can put this there and your contact information and any other things we want to add about some of the things you talked about. It may be in place of show notes, which I haven't done for a while because my website still isn't up and running. And until that time, I can at least add the resources, the things that you talked about, and links to them in there. So for those of you watching, just stay tuned. I'll post a notice when I do that.
Oh,
And
cool.
yeah, then we can keep the conversation going beyond this.
Yay. I love
Right.
it. I love it. You're a force for good in this world, Megan.
Oh, you're so sweet. Okay,
Putting
so
light in the world.
trying my best. And so, again, for everybody watching, if I don't pop up next week, for those of you who celebrate Christmas or Yule or Hanukkah or Kwanzaa, any of those or any of the other ones, I'm just going to bunch it together with holidays. I hope that's okay. But happy holidays and safe, festive, enjoyable gatherings with your peeps, whoever they may happen to be. Right. All right. Well, thanks again, Justine. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye, y'all. Bless you.